The candles had not even guttered. The soup was still warm in its silver tureen. The laughter of her younger sisters still hung in the air like perfume, sweet, oblivious, already dying. And then the doors of Ashworth House flew open with the force of a man who had never once in his life required permission, and the Duke of Cavendros filled the threshold like a storm filling a valley. He looked directly at her, only at her, and in a voice that had commanded parliaments, ruined lords, and silenced entire ballrooms, he said, "Give me an heir, Miss Ashworth, or I will take this house, this family, and every stone you call home before morning." 3 years before the doors flew open, it had snowed in London on a Thursday in late November, which was unusual enough to make the papers, and unusual enough to drive Lady Eleanora Ashworth, then 19 years of age, out of doors without a proper chaperone. She had not meant to go far, only to the corner of Belgrave Square, where the iron lampposts wore their caps of white, and the world had the extraordinary quality of silence that only heavy snowfall could manufacture in a city so relentlessly loud. She had stood there with her face tipped upward, her breath clouding before her, feeling for perhaps the last innocent time in her life entirely unhurried. She had not heard the carriage stop. She had not heard the door open. She had heard only a voice, low, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of a man who had long ago stopped needing to raise it, say from somewhere just behind her left shoulder, "You'll catch your death." She had turned. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, that is to say, the painters and the satirists who later attempted to capture the Duke of Cavendros always failed in the same direction. They made him too beautiful, too cold, too like a statue. In truth, standing in the snow with a single lamp casting half his face in amber and leaving the other half to shadow, he was simply overwhelming. Dark eyes set beneath the kind of brow that suggested not cruelty, but an intelligence so deep it had curdled into something more dangerous. A jaw that had been clenched, she suspected, since adolescence. Tall enough that the snow falling between them seemed to curve around him, as though the weather itself was deferential. She had not been frightened. This, she would later reflect, had been her first and most consequential mistake. "I am quite warm, Your Grace," she had replied, because she had recognized him. Everyone in London recognized him, and she had also recognized in the sudden quickening of her own pulse that there was no safe answer to give a man like this, so she had given him an honest one. Something had shifted in his expression, not a smile, something quieter and more alarming than a smile, a kind of noticing. He had inclined his head. He had returned to his carriage. He had been driven away into the white curtain of the storm. She had told no one, but someone had been watching from a darkened window across the square, a figure she had not noticed, standing motionless behind a pane of glass, observing the brief exchange with the careful, cataloguing attention of a person who made their living in the currency of other people's unguarded moments. A sealed letter had been written that same evening. It had not been delivered for 3 years, and then it had arrived at the desk of a man who collected debts the way other men collected paintings, with patience, with precision, and with the absolute certainty that all beautiful things, in time, could be owned. The snow had long since melted. The debt had not. The dining room of Ashworth House was, by any objective measure, the finest room in a house that could no longer afford to be fine. Eleanora knew this. She knew it in the way that daughters of declining families always know things, not from ledgers or solicitors' letters, which were addressed to her father and carefully intercepted before they could reach the breakfast table, but from the small accumulating evidence of managed dissent. The Sèvres china was now reserved for company only. The second footman had not been replaced when he left in August. The chandelier above the dining table held 16 candles where it had once held 32, and the resulting light was golden and intimate in a way that might have been romantic had it not been born of economy. Tonight they were 6 at dinner. Her father, Lord Ashworth, occupied the head of the table with the careful dignity of a man performing authority he could no longer fully substantiate. Her mother, Lady Ashworth, sat opposite, luminous still, regal in a gown that had been restyled twice and showed it only to the very well-trained eye. Eleanora's 2 younger sisters, Cecily and Jane, sat on one side, and Eleanora herself on the other, next to their guest, Mr. Hargrove, a barrister of middling fortune and excellent teeth, who had been angling for Cecily's hand with the polite persistence of water wearing away stone. The soup was a consommé. It was very good. Eleanora was listening to Jane describe in remarkable detail a tableau vivant she intended to organize for Christmas, when she felt it, not heard it, felt it, the change in pressure that preceded the door's opening, a kind of held breath in the very walls of the house. The doors opened. The butler, Fenwick, entered first, wearing an expression she had never in 22 years seen upon his face, naked, undiluted alarm. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He was not given the opportunity to speak. The Duke of Cavendros did not enter a room, he displaced it. He walked through the door, and the dining room, which had moments before been warm and candle-lit and entirely adequate, instantly revealed itself as small. Every shadow deepened, every flame leaned as though drawn toward him by some physical law that governed beautiful and terrible things equally. He wore black, which was not unusual for him. He wore it with the unconscious ease of a man who had never needed color to command attention. His gloat coat was not removed. His gloves were not removed. He did not, she noticed, with the part of her mind that refused to stop observing even when every other faculty was occupied with alarm, he did not so much as glance at her father. He looked at her, only at her. The table had gone entirely silent. Jane's description of the tableau vivant dissolved mid-sentence. Mr. Hargrove's spoon halted above his soup. Even the candles seemed to pause. Into that silence the Duke spoke. "Give me an heir, Miss Ashworth, or I will take this house, this family, and every stone you call home before morning." No preamble, no apology for the intrusion, no acknowledgment of her father, who had risen from his chair so abruptly that his napkin fell and lay on the floor like a small white surrender. Eleanora did not move. She was aware of Cecily's sharp intake of breath on her left, aware of Mr. Hargrove making a strangled sound that might have been the beginning of a protest, aware of her mother's hand gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. She was aware of all of these things, and she set them aside, and she looked back at the Duke with the same steady, measuring attention he was directing at her, and she said, in a voice she was quietly proud of for its absolute steadiness, "You have interrupted our soup, Your Grace. That seems rather dramatic, even for a duke." Something moved behind his eyes. That same quality she had recognized in the snow 3 years ago. Not a smile, but something that preceded one, that had perhaps once known how to become one, and since forgotten the final step. "Finish your soup, then," he said. "I can wait." He pulled out the empty chair, the chair that no one had invited him to occupy, sat down, and folded his gloved hands on the table, and waited, with the absolute patience of a man who had never in his life been made to wait for anything he genuinely wanted. And Eleanora Ashworth, daughter of a ruined lord, looked down at her consommé, which had gone quite cold, and understood that her life had just divided itself into a before and an after, and the before was already receding with considerable speed into a past she would not be permitted to return to. Her father did not make her wait long to understand. The Duke remained at the table through the entirety of the first course, silent, watchful, immovable as a landmark, while Lord Ashworth led him, with escalating desperation, through increasingly elaborate attempts at polite conversation, each one dissolving upon contact with the Duke's complete disinterest. It was only when the second course was cleared, untouched, because no one at the table possessed the composure required for appetite, that the Duke rose and addressed Lord Ashworth with the particular formality of a man who respected process only insofar as it allowed him to appear reasonable before he was not. "Lord Ashworth, I believe you know why I am here." Her father had aged, she thought, watching him. In the course of a single dinner, the performance of dignity he had maintained for years seemed to be peeling away in strips, like gilt from a frame. "My Lord Duke," he began, "the matter of the £53,000, the Duke said, not loudly, the way one might read a figure from a ledger, with neither pleasure nor regret. Accumulated over 9 years, 3 separate creditors, all of whom have, as of this morning, assigned their claims to me." Eleanora went very still. £53,000. She had known it was bad. She had not known the precise shape of bad. She understood now that there is a profound difference between knowing a storm is coming and learning its exact weight. "I have a proposition," the Duke continued, and here he turned, not to her father, but to her, across the table, across the wreckage of the dinner and the futures of her sisters and the dignity of her parents, directly to her. "I require a wife. More specifically, I require an heir and the legitimacy that accompanies one. The Cavendros line is not negotiable. It requires continuation." "You are not short of options, Your Grace," Eleanora said, and was aware of her mother's soft, agonized sound from the other end of the table. "I am not short of willing options," he agreed, as though she had made an interesting point. "I require a specific kind." "And what kind is that?" His gaze did not waver. "Intelligent, unafraid, capable of navigating the particular complexities of my household without either breaking or becoming a liability." She absorbed this. "You have described a housekeeper." This time there was no mistaking it. The corner of his mouth moved, fractionally, as though a very old mechanism had been engaged, rusty from disuse. "Miss Ashworth, I will retire your father's debts in their entirety. Your sisters will receive appropriate dowries. This house will remain in the family's possession. All I require is your consent, freely given, by tomorrow morning." "And if I withhold it?" He looked at her for a long, even moment. "Then the debt falls due at dawn, and I am not," he added with a quiet that was worse than shouting could ever have been, "a patient creditor." He left. The door closed behind him. The dining room seemed to exhale. And then Cecily began to weep, very quietly, and Jane gripped Eleanora's hand beneath the table, and her father sat back down in his chair and put his head in his hands, and Eleanora looked at the cold candles and the ruined dinner and the small white napkin still lying on the floor, and she felt not despair precisely, but something more structural, the specific sound a foundation makes when the last supporting beam has been identified as rotten. She had until dawn to consent to marrying a man who frightened her, not because he was cruel, but because he was not, and because she could not, for the life of her, determine what he actually wanted. She did not sleep. She sat at her writing desk until the ink dried in the nib and the candle burned to its collar, and she thought with the methodical thoroughness that had always been her best and most undervalued quality, dismissed by tutors as too analytical for a young lady, praised privately by her father in better years as the mind he'd wished he'd had in Parliament. She thought about the Duke, not romantically, architecturally. She was attempting to understand the structure of the thing she was walking into, and to locate, before she walked into it, the exits. Cavendrus. The title was ancient, older than half the institutions that currently presumed to govern England. The man who bore it was 34, a widower of 4 years. His first wife, Lady Catherine Marsh, had died of a fever in the 2nd year of their marriage and left no children. The papers had mourned her briefly and moved on. The Duke had not appeared in society for nearly a year after her death, and when he had returned, something in him had settled into its current configuration, that particular quality of absolute, impenetrable composure, as though every human emotion had been placed behind glass, where it could be observed but not touched. What she did not know, why her, why now, why this specific demand, delivered in this specific manner, theatrical, public, intentionally destabilizing, when a man of his resources could have achieved the same end through solicitors and quiet negotiation. He had wanted her to see him. He had wanted the room to see her see him. She could not determine why, and the inability nagged at her like a splinter lodged too deep to reach. At 6 o'clock she walked to her father's study and told him she would consent. He wept. She held his hand. She did not weep, because she had privately decided, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, that she was not going to approach this marriage as a tragedy. She was going to approach it as a problem, and she was, by temperament and by practice, very good at problems. The Cavendrus carriage arrived at 9. It was obscenely fine, lacquered black, the ducal crest in silver on the door, pulled by 4 matched greys whose breath smoked in the November cold. The coachman did not speak. The interior was upholstered in dark blue silk and smelled of cedar and something else, leather and ink, and a third note she could not identify, which she would only later recognize as the smell of the Duke himself, present in his absence, marking the carriage as his territory. Her trunk was loaded. Cecily clung to her in the doorway. Jane pressed a small book of poetry in her hands. For courage, she whispered, and Eleanora tucked it into her coat pocket and stepped into the carriage, and did not allow herself to look back as the wheels began to turn. She watched London thin and recede, the grand streets giving way to meaner ones, then to roads, then to countryside, grey and vast under a winter sky the colour of pewter. She read 3 pages of the poetry before she realized she had not absorbed a single word. She was thinking about the Duke's eyes, not their colour, dark, with that quality of depth that is so rarely literal and so consistently was in him. She was thinking about what she had seen in them when she had refused to be frightened by his entrance, that fractional, rusty, almost smile. He had expected fear. She had given him something else, and it had, briefly, thrown him. Good, she thought. If she was to be taken to his house and made to fulfill a contract she had not signed, she intended to remain, in every way she could manage, unpredictable. The carriage rolled on. The city was gone. The trees lining the road were bare, their branches black against the sky, reaching upward like the hands of people who had been asking for something for a very long time. And ahead, though she could not yet see it, Cavendrus Hall waited, vast, dark, beautiful, and full of secrets that had been accumulating for decades, patient as interest on an old debt. The hall appeared out of the dusk like something dreamed. Not gradually, it did not emerge from the tree line or resolve slowly from mist the way lesser houses did. It simply materialized at a turn in the drive, whole and immediate and enormous, as though it had been waiting there with the confidence of a thing that had never needed to announce itself. 6 stories of pale stone, quarried from some northern landscape, and carved with the severe, unadorned elegance of a preceding century. No fussiness about it, no decorative excess. It was all proportion and weight, and the particular authority of a structure that had housed dukes for long enough to believe that dukes were natural features of the landscape, like hills or rivers. 300 windows, perhaps, the upper floors dark, the lower lit with a cold, measured light that seemed to illuminate without warming. 2 wings extended from the central block with mathematical symmetry, flanking a forecourt in which the gravel was raked to an almost aggressive perfection. It was, without question, the most beautiful and oppressive thing Eleonora had ever seen. She stepped down from the carriage into that raked gravel and looked up at the house, and the house, in the manner of very old and very large things, looked back. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elderton, met her at the door, a woman of perhaps 60, with the iron posture and the carefully neutral expression of someone who had served in the house full of secrets long enough to have made peace with not asking questions. She welcomed Eleonora with precise courtesy, neither warm nor cold, and led her through the entrance hall. God, the entrance hall, marble floors the color of bone, portraits ascending both staircases with the relentless accumulation of ancestors who all appeared to share the quality of focused, disconcerting scrutiny, to a set of apartments in the east wing. The apartments were extraordinary. That was the problem with all of it. The house was extraordinary, and the extraordinariness of it was itself a kind of pressure. The furniture was priceless, the hangings deep crimson and gold, the fireplace already lit against the chill. Everything was perfect, everything was impersonal. It was the hospitality of great wealth rather than great warmth, and the distinction was as cold as the marble below. "His Grace dines at 8, Mrs. Elderton said at the door. "He requests the pleasure of your company." The pleasure of. Eleonora recognized the language of requests that were not requests. "Of course," she said. She was left alone. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment, listening to the house settle around her, the creak of old timber, the distant sound of wind against the casements, the absolute, layered silence of a building too large for the number of people it contained. Then she did the thing she always did when confronted with an unfamiliar environment. She began, systematically, to look. The desk held nothing personal. The shelves held volumes of ornamental variety, selected for appearance rather than reading. But on the window-sill, half hidden behind the curtain, as though set down by someone who had been reading at the window and then been interrupted, was a small book. She lifted it. It was a volume of natural philosophy, heavily annotated in a small, precise hand. Every margin was full of commentary, disagreements, questions, the occasional terse wrong, a handful of starred passages with the single word yes beside them. She turned to the frontispiece, Ex Libris, E. Cavendros. She stood very still. E. Not the Duke's given name, which was James Lysander, a fact that appeared in the papers on the occasion of his first marriage. E. She turned the pages slowly, reading the annotations. The voice in the margins was not the voice she had met in her dining room. It was sharper, more uncertain, more alive, the voice of someone who was still working things out rather than someone who had arrived at his conclusions and sealed them away forever. Younger, she realized, these annotations were old. She was still reading when the clock on the mantel struck 7, and she became aware, with the particular alertness of a woman who has learned to trust the hairs rising on the back of her neck, that she was not entirely alone in the apartment. She turned. The connecting door, which she had not noticed before, which was set flush with the paneling and was nearly invisible in the candlelight, stood 1 inch open, and from the gap she could see nothing, only shadow, but the shadow was watching her. She did not flinch. She did not call out.
She set down the book with deliberate care, walked to the connecting door and pushed it fully open. The Duke of Cavendros stood in the room beyond, a study she registered distantly, all dark wood and banked firelight, holding a glass of brandy that he had not drunk, looking at her with an expression so carefully composed that the effort of composing it was itself legible to anyone paying close enough attention. "You were reading my annotations," he said. "You were watching me read them." A pause. "It was my room once. You have given me your room. My childhood room. There are many rooms in this house." He said it without inflection, but something passed through his eyes, a flash of something biographical, rapidly suppressed. She held his gaze. "Who is E, Your Grace?" "My brother," he said, after a moment that cost him something. "Edmund. He died at 21. The room absorbed this. The fire settled. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it, and watched the meaning of it land on him with the slightly stunned quality of a man who had been offered something in a currency he no longer trusted. He looked away first, set down the untouched brandy, and then, with the air of a man who has decided something, he crossed to the wall beside the fireplace and pressed a panel she had taken for solid wood. It swung inward. Beyond it was not a room, but an alcove, and inside the alcove, lit by a single lamp on a bracket, was a map, not a geographical map, a network, names connected by lines in red ink, some crossed out, some circled, spreading across a large sheet of vellum, pinned to the wall with the organized intensity of someone conducting a very serious investigation. Several of the names she saw she recognized, members of Parliament, a cabinet minister, a lord she had met twice at country parties and found oddly evasive. "This," the Duke said from just behind her left shoulder, a position she recognized with a sensation that was not quite vertigo from 3 years ago in the snow, "is why I need a wife." She turned to look at him. He was closer than she had realized, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension in the jaw, the quality of exhaustion beneath the composure, the kind that is not physical but structural, the tiredness of a man who has been holding a very large thing together, alone for a very long time. "You have not been seeking money," she said. "No. You have been building a case against these men for 3 years. And you need a wife because the position I am about to occupy requires it, because the society I am about to enter and dismantle will not grant access to an unmarried man, however titled. Because," he said, and here his voice did something she had not heard it do before, dropped half a register, acquired a texture, "I need someone with me who will not be deceived by the performance, someone who sees what is actually in the room." She thought of the dinner, the intentional theatrics of his entrance. She thought of him watching her, not in the room but at her window. She thought of the snow 3 years ago and the careful way he had looked at her and not forgotten. "You have been watching me for 3 years," she said, not accusingly, architecturally. "I have been considering you for 3 years," he said, with a precision that she understood was, for him, a distinction that mattered enormously. She turned back to the map, looked at the crossed-out names, the circled ones. "What did these men do?" she asked. A long silence. "They killed my brother," he said, "and they have been operating with complete impunity ever since, because," he added very quietly, "I did not know." The fire popped, the lamp swayed. She looked at the map and then the Duke, and felt the entire architecture of the situation shift beneath her feet, the flaw that had been labeled captor and captive, revealing itself as something far more complex, far more dangerous, and she recognized this with the particular clarity of a person who has been paying attention, far more interesting. "Tell me their names," she said. He studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he told her something true.
His name had been Edmund James Cavendros, and he had been brilliant. The Duke told her this not sentimentally, but factually, the way one recites data that is too painful to render in any other register. Edmund had been a mathematician, a natural philosopher, the annotator of the book she had found on the windowsill. He had been, at 20, recruited into a particular government committee, ostensibly concerned with colonial trade policy, actually the instrument through which a small group of powerful men had been systematically redirecting treasury funds into their own accounts for nearly a decade. Edmund had discovered this. Edmund had documented it. Edmund had brought his evidence to his brother, then newly come into the dukedom at 25, and together they had agreed to take it higher. What they had not agreed upon, what the Duke had not foreseen, was that higher was exactly where the corruption lived. Edmund had died 6 weeks later. A riding accident, the official report said. A lonely road, a startled horse, a broken neck. Clean, plausible, impossible to disprove. The Duke had spent 4 years grieving and 3 years building, methodically, obsessively, with the focused fury of a man who had converted his grief entirely into purpose, because the alternative was to be destroyed by it. He had cultivated sources, he had acquired evidence, he had, through the mechanism of patient accumulation, purchased the debts of 3 separate creditors, one of whom, it transpired, was owed money by a man connected to the committee. A thread, the first thread. Lord Ashworth had been one of those debts, not a guilty party, the Duke was precise on this point, watching her face, but a man whose financial desperation had made him briefly useful to the wrong people, who had accepted a sum he did not know the source of, who was now, technically, vulnerable. "He does not know," the Duke said, "your father. He is an accessory without knowledge. You could have destroyed him, yes. But you used him instead, to get to me, to get to this room." He gestured at the map, at the alcove, at the assembled evidence of 3 years of singular purpose. "I need someone who can move through drawing rooms and dinner tables and ballrooms and report back with the accuracy of an intelligence officer. Someone who will not attract suspicion because they are," a pause, careful, "precisely what society expects them to be. A new young duchess, decorative, occupied with the performance of her role, while being anything but." She was quiet for a moment. The fire had burned lower. Outside the wind had picked up, and the tall windows were talking to it in their language of old glass and older wood. "You are asking me," she said slowly, "to enter a conspiracy. I am offering you a partnership. You threatened my family's home. I needed your consent to be genuine. Fear-driven compliance would have been insufficient for what I require." He looked at her steadily. "I needed to know when you stepped into that carriage that you had chosen to step into it." She thought about this. It was infuriating. It was also, she noted with reluctant intellectual honesty, the kind of logic she could respect, the logic of someone who understood that a person acting under compulsion was a liability, while a person acting with full information was an asset. "The debt," she said, "is it real? Yes. And you will retire it? The moment we are married. And my sister's dowries, as agreed." She looked at him for a long time. He met her gaze with that quality of stillness that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but discipline, the practiced composure of someone who had learned at considerable cost to keep his face from betraying what was behind it. "I want access to the map,
Full access. I want to know every name, every connection, every piece of evidence you have gathered. If I am to be useful to you, I need to understand the architecture of the thing. A pause. Agreed. And I want your word, your actual word, not a legal instrument, that you will not make decisions that affect my family without consulting me first. He considered her. Something shifted in his expression, that mechanism again, that old and rusty thing, engaging. You have it, he said. She extended her hand, a handshake, the kind that was not social but binding, the kind between people entering an arrangement that neither courts nor solicitors would recognize, but that both parties understood implicitly to be the more serious contract. He looked at her hand. Then, with a care that was almost ceremonial, he removed his glove and took it. His hand was warm. This surprised her, and she did not show it. "Then we are," she said, "allies. For now," he said, and there was something in the "for now" that she turned over in her mind long after she had returned to her apartments, long after the fire had burned down and the house had gone quiet, long after she lay in the darkness and listened to the wind, trying to determine exactly what he had meant and why the ambiguity of it would not let her sleep. She learned the map. She spent the following days in the study with the alcove door open and the Duke beside her at the large oak desk, not always speaking, often simply working in parallel, their respective papers spread before them, the fire between them and the winter outside the windows. It was an odd domesticity. It was not comfortable exactly. There was always a current between them, a low-level electrical quality in the air of any room they occupied together, as though they were two instruments tuned to different keys that produced, in proximity, an inadvertent chord. She read his evidence, all of it, and she was, she privately admitted, impressed. The architecture of the case he had built was elegant, not flashy, not broad, but narrow and deep and precisely calibrated. He had not attempted to prove everything. He had identified 3 specific financial transactions, traceable through 3 specific intermediaries to 3 specific men, all leading back to the night of Edmund's death. He needed only one more piece, confirmation of a letter that was known to exist but had not been located, written by the committee's principal architect to a government official, discussing the management of a problem that Edmund had represented. The letter, if it existed, was almost certainly held by a man named Lord Stanton Belvale, a peer of the First Order, handsome in a corrupt way, a fixture of every important drawing-room in England, a man who would be attending, the Duke told her, the Harwich Winter Ball in 3 weeks' time. "He will not speak to you," Eleanora said, studying the network. "You are too threatening to him. He knows what you're doing, even if he cannot prove you're doing it." "Precisely. But he will speak to a new young duchess." She looked up. "Particularly if she appears to be somewhat underestimated by her husband." The Duke looked at her. "You would find that distasteful." "I would find it effective." She held his gaze. "I am asking you to trust my performance of a role. Can you do that?" A pause that lasted several seconds longer than she expected. "Yes," he said, at last, and she understood this as significant, though she could not yet articulate precisely why. The days accrued. She began, unexpectedly, to know the house, not just its geography, but its character, the particular melancholy of the East Gallery at dusk, where Edmund's portrait hung beside the Duke's, 2 brothers in different lights. The library, which was the one room in Cavendross Hall that felt genuinely inhabited, its shelves worn at hand height, its window-seat cushion indented from years of use. The walled garden, iron-brown in winter, which she walked each morning, and where one day she found the Duke already present, standing in the center of the dead rose-beds, looking up at the grey sky with an expression she suspected he would not have worn if he had known she was there. She had turned back. He had heard her. "Miss Ashworth? Your Grace, forgive the intrusion." "It is not an intrusion." He had looked at her with the particular attention she was growing accustomed to, and had not grown accustomed to. "Edmund planted these roses, the summer before he died. They have not been removed." She had not said anything trite. She had said, "He planted them to last." And the Duke had looked at the dead roses for a moment, and then at her, and something in him had shifted. Not the mechanism this time, but something below the mechanism, something older and more fundamental. "Will you walk with me?" he had asked. They had walked for an hour in the dead garden. He had told her about Edmund, small things, specific things, the way he had laughed too loudly at his own jokes, his absolute inability to navigate a ballroom without stepping on someone, his habit of leaving books in every room of the house as though shedding thoughts as he moved. Eleonora had listened with the full quality of her attention, which was, she had been told, somewhat disconcerting. The feeling of being completely heard is unexpectedly intimate. At the garden gate he had paused. "You are not what I anticipated," he said. "What did you anticipate?" He had considered. "Someone easier." She had laughed, genuinely, fully, the laugh that Cecily always said was too loud for a drawing-room, and therefore, Eleonora had always maintained, the right size for a person. He had looked at her as though the laugh had struck him somewhere undefended. That evening, at dinner, they dined together now, a practice that had established itself without formal arrangement. He had poured her wine without being asked, and she had thanked him without ceremony, and they had sat in companionable silence that was not silence exactly, but a kind of ongoing conversation conducted beneath words, in the language of proximity and attention. She had noticed when she reached for the salt that his hand had moved, reflexively, involuntarily, as though to hand it to her, before he had arrested the motion and returned his hand to the table. She had noticed. She had said nothing. But that night, lying in the darkness, she had placed her palm flat against the mattress, and she had thought about how warm his hand had been, and she had thought, "Oh, this is a different kind of problem entirely."
She had been presented to society as the Duchess of Cavendros 3 days before the Harwich ball, in a ceremony of such crisp legal efficiency that she had found herself married and titled before the mourning was properly established. The Duke had stood beside her with the impeccable composure that she now knew was constructed rather than natural, and she had stood beside him with the impeccable composure she had always had, which was natural, but now served an additional purpose, and together they had made what the attending guests privately agreed was an astonishing couple. The Duke as dark and controlled as ever, and beside him a woman who met his eyes level and was not afraid of him, which everyone agreed was either very impressive or very unwise, and which was, in fact, both. Harwich House was an exercise in the particular excess of a family that had been rich for generations without developing taste. Gold everywhere, too many flowers, 100 people in rooms designed for 70, every surface reflecting candlelight until the whole affair had the quality of being inside something on fire. She wore dark green. The Duke had not told her what to wear, which she respected. She had chosen it herself, the color of old forests, of things that endure. Her hair up, 2 small diamonds at her throat, nothing excess. She wanted to be precisely notable enough, and no more. Belvale found her at the 4th hour of the evening, which was precisely when she had calculated he would, after the first social circuits had been completed, when people had taken their measures of one another, and were beginning to look for more interesting conversations, and when the host's very good claret had done approximately 2 glasses of work on the average guest. He was tall, fair-haired, with the easy charm of someone who had never needed to work for approval.
he introduced himself with a smile that she recognized as the kind designed to make women feel specially selected. "Your Grace," he said, "I have been most eager to make your acquaintance. Cavendros is a fortunate man." She smiled, not warmly, but with the kind of intelligent appreciation that suggests the compliment has been heard and evaluated. "Lord Belvale, I have heard your name. One hopes in favorable connection." "In connection with a particular committee," she said, pleasantly, watching him the way a chess player watches an opponent's hand move toward a piece. "I have been reading. My husband has an extraordinary library." The smile held, but something behind it sharpened. "Committees are tedious things," he said. "Some of them, I'm sure." She accepted a glass from a passing footman. "I found myself particularly interested in the questions of internal oversight. Who watches the watchers, as it were? A philosophical concern, a practical one." She looked up at him with the expression of a woman who is slightly over her head and perfectly aware of it, the exact performance of strategic self-presentation she had discussed with the Duke. "I'm afraid I've rather worried my husband by reading in his study. He says some papers are not intended for, well," she dropped her eyes, "new eyes." Belvale was very still. "He keeps the study locked as a rule," he said, and his voice had a new quality, the flatness of a man calculating rather than conversing. "Yes," she said, "but he is sometimes forgetful of the connecting door." She looked up then and let him see, briefly, carefully, the flicker of a woman who was frightened and hiding it, a woman who had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and was perhaps looking for someone to tell her it didn't mean what she thought. Belvale looked at her for a long moment, and then, with the smooth inevitability of a man who trusted that charming women were manageable problems, "Perhaps you might describe what you saw. Perhaps," she said, "this is a conversation better had away from the dancing." He offered his arm. She took it, and across the ballroom, through the press of dancers and the blaze of too many candles, she felt the Duke's eyes find her, steady, trusting, present, and she did not look back, because she was already walking, and she had work to do.
She had what she needed by 11 o'clock. Not the letter. Belvale was too practiced for that, too careful, even half-charmed and somewhat Bouver-clareted, but something better in its way, a confirmation. He had spoken of the committee in terms that assumed her complicity. He had referred to documents that require management with the breezy confidence of a man who believed himself to be bringing an uncertain quantity into the fold, and in doing so had described, with remarkable precision, exactly what those documents contained. He had also told her where they were kept. Not in so many words, but she had been listening with her whole self, the part that observed rooms and the part that observed people, and the part that had been trained over weeks of study to read the negative space around what powerful men chose to say, and she had heard it. She found the Duke in the East Corridor, where he had clearly been stationed for the last 20 minutes. "He keeps the letter at Belvale Park," she said quietly. "Not in London, the estate archive. He referred to it as his grandfather's correspondence, a phrase I believe is a convention between them." The Duke absorbed this without visible reaction. Then, "You are well?" "I am well." He did not. "I am perfectly well," she said, and something in her voice must have carried, because he stopped asking and simply looked at her, that complete, particular attention that had become, over the weeks, the thing she unconsciously moved toward in any room. "You were extraordinary," he said. It came out differently than he had intended, she thought, less calculated, more plain, the voice from the margins of the book. She felt it land somewhere unguarded. "Do not make me self-conscious," she said, "when I have been so collected all evening." His mouth moved, the full version this time, brief,
real, transformative in the way that very rare things are, that rearrange the face and reveal the person behind the architecture. He had smiled at her. She looked away first, which was its own kind of revelation. The carriage home was dark and warm, and the road was long, and neither of them spoke very much, and the silence was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but of people who have too much, and know it, and are moving carefully around the perimeter of the knowledge. Outside, the countryside passed in darkness, and the stars were very bright, and Eleonora sat with her hands folded in her lap, and felt the very specific kind of terror that is not fear of a person, but fear of what you are becoming in proximity to one. At the door of her apartments he had paused. "Eleonora," he said, her name, without the title, for the first time. His voice was very quiet. She turned. He was standing in the corridor, one hand braced against the doorframe, looking at her with an expression that had given up trying to be composed, raw for a moment, simply his actual face. "I did not anticipate," he said, "that this arrangement would—" He stopped, began again. "I want you to know that regardless of what happens next, my word holds. Your family is safe, fully and unconditionally." She looked at him for a long moment. "James," she said, his name, returned to him. She watched the impact of it. "I know." She went inside. She closed the door. She stood in the center of her room, his room once, and pressed her hand to her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat, which was doing something entirely undignified. And then, from beneath the connecting door, in the thin line of lamplight that came from his study, a shadow. He had stood there for a long moment, she could tell, and then it had moved away. She did not sleep again that night, but this time she found she minded less. The letter was retrieved on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of December, by means of an operation so precisely planned that she would later reflect it had the quality of a very good sonnet, 14 parts, internally rhyming, arriving at its couplet with the satisfaction of something that could not have ended otherwise. She did not go to Belvale Park herself. That role fell to a man in the Duke's employ, a quiet, capable individual whose existence she had only recently learned of, who had, through channels she was deliberately not briefed on, accessed the archive and removed the relevant correspondence before the household had risen for breakfast. The letter was on the Duke's desk by noon. She had been in the study when he read it. She had been reading the natural philosophy volume with the annotations, which she had quietly relocated from the windowsill to the desk over the course of several weeks, treating it as her own, a migration that the Duke had observed and not remarked upon, which she understood as a form of permission. He read the letter once, set it down, read it again. Then he said very quietly, "It names everyone." She came to stand beside him. He tilted the page so she could read. The letter named the committee principals, the government official who had authorized Edmund's silencing, and, this was the thing that stopped her breath, a second, parallel act. Not just Edmund, a member of Parliament, 2 years after Edmund's death, who had independently stumbled onto the same evidence and had met the same end on the same road. "2 people," she said. "2 people I knew of. There may be others. This is enough to bring down 3 peers, a cabinet minister, and 2 members of Parliament. Yes." His jaw was set, but his eyes were not the calculated, guarded eyes she had first seen across her family's dining table. They were the eyes from the garden, from the corridor outside her door, from the margin of a book, open and full of something that had been waiting a very long time to be done. She put her hand over his, where it lay on the desk beside the letter. He looked down at her hand, then up at her. "It is over then," she said, "or the beginning of over. There will be a reckoning. It will be public, and it will be ugly, and some of these men have friends who will not—" The door opened. Not Fenwick, not Mrs. Alderton. The figure in the doorway was one she recognized from the Harwich ball, one of Belvale's companions, a man whose name she had not caught, and whom she had clocked as peripheral, unthreatening. She understood in the space of a half-second that she had miscalculated. He was not peripheral, and he was holding something. What followed happened very quickly, and in her memory, very slowly, the simultaneous acceleration and dilation that accompanies moments of genuine danger. The Duke was between her and the door before she had processed his movement, simply there, the way large, capable men can be simply elsewhere and then simply present, as though the steps between are a formality. His voice was entirely level. "Hawthorpe, you are making a very significant error. The letter, Your Grace." Hawthorpe's voice was controlled, but thin over its control, the voice of a man who is frightened, and therefore more dangerous, not less. "Give it to me, and this ends here." "It does not end here," the Duke said. "It ended the moment you walked through that door. You have entered my house uninvited, in the presence of my wife. Every servant in this hall has seen your face." A pause. Belvale, the Duke said, "will not be in a position to do anything by tomorrow morning. I have sent copies of this letter to 3 separate addresses. You may take the original if it makes you feel better. It will change nothing." She watched Hawthorpe. She watched the moment. It was visible, the way a crack in ice is visible, spreading, when he understood that he had lost, that it had, in fact, already been over before he arrived, that he was a piece being played in a game that had been concluded. He left. He did not take the letter. The door closed. The Duke turned. She was already looking at him. She was aware of this with some clarity, shaking very slightly, not from fear, but from the specific physical aftermath of sustained intensity, the body releasing what the mind had held in check. He crossed the room. He stood before her. "Eleonora," he said, just that. She put her both hands against his chest, not pushing, simply placing them there, feeling the solid, real, present fact of him, alive, unhurt, here. "Copies," she said, 3 separate addresses. You had already sent them, before you woke this morning. You anticipated he would come. I anticipated something would come." His voice was very quiet. His hands had come up to cover yours, pressing them gently against his chest. You looked up at him, and James Lysander Cavendros, Duke of Cavendros, grieving brother and patient architect of justice, and the man who had walked into her family's dining room like a storm and reordered everything she had known, looked at her with an expression so unguarded, so complete, so entirely divested of the dross he had kept between himself and the world for years, that she felt it like a physical opening, like a window thrown wide after a very long winter. "I married you to serve a purpose, and then something changed." "Something changed," she agreed. "I find that I am not willing to go back to what was before." She turned her hands over beneath his, so they were palm to palm, fingers between fingers. "Then don't," she said. Outside, the December wind moved through the bare rose garden, and the candles in their sconces swayed, and Cavendros Hall, which had stood for 300 years and held its secrets the way old houses do, patiently, heavily, without ever quite letting them go, seemed to exhale.
3 months later, the trial was a sensation. The papers called it the greatest scandal in 30 years. 4 men were formally charged, 2 others resigned their posts before charges could be laid, and a government committee that had operated in shadow for a decade was dissolved by order of Parliament in a session that lasted 6 hours and was described by those present as the most charged atmosphere since the Reform debates. Lord Belvale's name was among those destroyed by the letter. Hawthorpe disappeared from London. His current whereabouts were unknown, and the Duke's quiet people were looking. Lord Ashworth's debts were retired, as promised. Cecily accepted Mr. Hargrove's proposal in February, in a ceremony that was small and extremely cheerful. Jane sent weekly letters, long, enthusiastic, full of news and plans for the Christmas tableau that had been so dramatically interrupted 4 months earlier, which she still intended to stage undeterred. Eleanora read them in the library at Cavendross Hall, in the window seat with the indented cushion, in the mornings before the Duke came in from his ride, which he did at 9 o'clock with the predictability that characterized everything he did, and which she had discovered, somewhat to her own astonishment, she had come to rely on, to look forward to. The sound of his step in the corridor, the way the room organized itself differently around his presence. The roses in the walled garden had been left alone through winter. They were showing their first new growth, small, red, determined in the March light. Edmund's annotations were now beside her own in the margins of the natural philosophy volume, her handwriting distinct from his, but in conversation with it, continuing arguments he had begun and had not been permitted to finish. She had not asked the Duke what they were now, what the arrangement was now that its stated purpose had been fulfilled. She had not asked because the asking seemed, somehow, redundant. And he had not clarified because he was a man who expressed himself most fluently in actions. The way he always poured her coffee before his own, the way he had framed the note she had written to Cecily about her engagement, the way he stood in any room she entered with that particular quality of attention she had stopped pretending was purely professional. She had not asked. But one morning, in the library, she had found a letter on the window seat, sealed, her name on the outside, in his hand. She had opened it slowly. Inside, a single page, 7 words. I believe this is also something more. She folded it very carefully. She placed it in the natural philosophy volume, between a page he had annotated yes and a page she had annotated yes precisely. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, just arrived from his ride, coat still cold from the morning air, watching her with that expression she had catalogued and treasured and could not adequately describe, except to say that it was the face of a man who had been held under water for a very long time and had only recently remembered that he could breathe. She lifted the book just slightly so he could see where she had placed his letter. He crossed the room. He sat beside her in the window seat, close enough that their shoulders touched. He opened the book to a page she had not annotated and handed her the pen. Outside, in the walled garden, Edmund's roses continued their small, determined work. And from a window of the east wing, a window in a room that had been empty for years, a face watched the library window, unmoving, patient, waiting. A hand held a letter that had not yet been delivered, sealed in wax the color of dried blood, addressed in a hand that neither of them would recognize, bearing a name beneath the address that would, when they eventually read it, unravel everything they believed they had put to rest. The seal was pressed with the crest of a family that officially ceased to exist, but the wax was fresh.